So sellers finance to buy a business. That's when the owner of the business basically lends the money to the purchaser to buy the business. But there's more than one way of doing that, and one of the more popular ways is called earnouts. Now in this video I'll explain what an earnout is, how it works, and how you can use earnouts to buy a business. So I've been a business broker for, close to 20 years, and this is the best form of seller's finance that I've seen over that period of time. Works for both parties and gives both parties a good deal in the process. So in a previous video, I talked about vendor finance, seller's finance if you like, and I talked about how seller's finance works as basically a loan, and I used an example. Well, this is a step up from that. This is called an earnout, and basically what you're doing is you're valuing the business on its future performance. So you're going to say, I'm going to pay this much now, but if it does certain things, we're going to pay a little bit extra. Now, it's a good way for both the buyer and the seller to get full value out of the business. If the business is growing and the buyer has to pay a little bit more for the business under an earnout, that's great. They're winning because the business is worth more and they've made more money. Equally, the seller is also winning because they're getting full value for their business. But how does that work in practice? Now, buyers believe that if the seller thinks it's a good business, they should finance the buyer into the business. They say, well, if it's a great business and if you've got confidence that it's going to work going forward, you should finance me into the business. Now, the seller, on the other hand, they go, well, yes, it's a great business. And it's a great business because, I know what I'm doing and I'm running it. You might not do anything. You might be lazy, you might be useless, and you might run my business into the ground. So why should I finance you? So earnouts is a way that both parties get rewarded for their hard work. The seller gets rewarded because the value can increase in an earnout. The buyer gets rewarded because the seller's funding him, and he's going to get a good, profitable, strong business. But how does that actually work? But one of the issues with using earnouts is that buyers want to use earnouts because they have no confidence in their own ability. They're scared of their own shadow and they're frightened of risk. So what they're trying to do is put all the risk onto the seller of the business. Now, why would you do that? So the only way that earnouts work well, and that is if there is a risk reward on both sides. And I'll give you an example of that in a minute. But to get that risk reward on both sides, both the buyer and the seller must be confident in their own abilities and confident in the business. And I'll explain a little bit more about that as we go along. Now, where earnouts don't work well is in a business that's reasonably flat and reasonably steady and is not showing a great deal of growth. So it's hard to predict what the future performance of the business is going to be, whether it's going to fluctuate, and that's where earnouts really work for both parties. I'll explain that in a second. So if the business is flat, all you're doing is basically paying the same value in a year or two's time as you would now. So there's not much in it for the seller of the business. There's not much extra in it for them. So it's hard to get a seller to agree to an earnout if there is no good reason for it. So the best use of earnouts is when the business is showing good growth, showing steady growth. And that way both parties can get full benefit from an earnout. Let me show you how that works. So we've talked about earnouts and the whys, but this is a practical example of the best way to use an earnout to buy a business or to value a business. So if we take a business and we look at a graph like so, and let's say across the bottom we have time, and up here we have revenue or profits or whatever your earnout metric is. And say the business, ideally, the business is doing this sort of thing. It's growing like that. So we have a business that's on a steady upward trajectory. So over time, it's making more revenue and more profits. So if we value the business today, for example, so that's today, we're going to value the business against this level of profit. So that's how we are going to establish the value. But what happens over time? Say you do an earnout over maybe 2 years, something like that. And in 2 years' time, instead of the business being there, it's going to be up here, isn't it? So again, take that time, take that. The value of the business has increased by that much over a period of time. So how do you establish what you do with that value? Well, that's where an earnout comes in, and that's how an earnout is calculated. What you do is you calculate the value of the business here, and say the value of the business there is, I don't know, $50. But the value of the business here might be $100. So therefore, if we wait 2 years, it's going to be $50 more, isn't it, in value? So what we do is we say, well, we'll pay the $50 up front. That'll be our upfront cost, our upfront payment. And the balance, the other 50, that'll be paid out over that time frame. And let's call it 2 years. Okay, so that's simple. If the business achieves that milestone, it pays out the extra money. But what if it doesn't? Well, if it doesn't, you calculate where the business falls. So say it arrives at that point there, and that's maybe $75. The earnout value is the difference between the two. So it's a $25 earnout. But what happens if the business ends up here in 2 years' time? Or that curve, instead of going straight like that, it takes a steep upward trajectory. So at that point in time, the business is suddenly worth this amount of money. So maybe it's worth, instead of being 100, it's worth 125. So the earnout calculation then becomes 75. Does that make sense? So basically, you've got a business, you've said at the very beginning, we're going to pay this 50. We're then going to look at the earnout calculation. If it falls behind where we suspect it to be, we're going to add 25. However, if the earnout goes ahead of where we're going to be, then we're going to pay out maybe 75, or failing that, we're just going to pay out the normal 50, depending on where it fits. So earnouts, they allow the business valuation to fluctuate, and they also allow the end payment to fluctuate, and I'll talk about that a little bit further on. Well, if you're enjoying this video and getting something out of it, and I certainly hope you are, there's a button designed just for people like yourselves. It's called the like button. It's just down there. It looks like that. Give it a click. If you're feeling generous, you might also want to use the super thanks button, and I'd love you to subscribe. Any one of those three or all of those three, and that would be greatly appreciated. Thanks very much. Back to earnouts. Of course, the question then becomes, what should we base the earnout metric on? Should it be revenue or should it be profit? Now, of course, the buyer is going to be wanted on profit because they're basing all their calculations on how much money the business is going to make. Now, the seller, if they're smart, they're going to want to base it on revenue. Now, simply put, if you base it on revenue, it is very, very difficult to fudge the figures. It's hard to make things up. It's hard to change the numbers. If you base it on profit, you can load the expenses with all sorts of things, management fees, consultancy, all sorts of things to reduce that profit level. So if you're going to do an earnout, the most critical thing is to decide what metric you're going to base it on. Now, if you base it on revenue, that's fairly easy. That's the money coming in. But if you're going to base it on profit, you have to have written agreement on the accounting system that you're going to use, the process that you're going to use, and what can and cannot be allowed in the expenses or in the wages. I mean, what's to stop the buyer from then employing 5 of his family members to reduce the profit down and pay them as employees? So it's very much a concern of the buyer and the seller to get this right and to get the metric right and the way the metric is calculated. Now, the earnout can be over time. It can be over 1, 2, or 3 years. It can be paid quarterly, it can be paid 6 monthly, or it can be paid annually. But either way, all of that must be documented at the very beginning. The only way to avoid argument, as I've said before, is to make sure everything's documented and have those payment schedules set out accordingly. Now, there may be interest calculated, there may be penalty interest for late payments, all those sort of things have to be included in the loan document that's drawn up between the seller and the buyer. Well, I hope all this earnout stuff makes sense. Let me know in the comments down below if it does or if it doesn't, and any questions you've got, please let me know down below in the comments. Now, it would make good sense for both the buyer and the seller to employ the outgoing owner, to employ the seller in the business. That way, the seller can keep an eye on what's going on, he can manage what's going on to the best of his abilities, but it also gives the seller access to that extra knowledge over that earnout period. And that can be invaluable to ensure continuity of the business and continuity of clients, customers, markets, all those sort of things. So you should always consider, if you're buying under an earnout and selling under an earnout, to make sure that the seller is included as a staff member over a period of time. Now, you may not want them full-time. It may be a 2 or a 3 day or a part-time situation as a contractor, but they should be employed by the business going forward. So what are the pros and cons of using an earnout to sell or buy a business? Well, let's talk about the cons first of all. Now, the cons really apply to the seller of the business. Once the business is sold, the seller has no control over the business. It's the buyer's business. Now, if the buyer does run it into the ground, that's the end of the business, and the seller doesn't get his earnout payments. And there's not a lot you can do about it. And once the business is non-performing, an earnout reflects that non-performance. So that's the single biggest con. The second con is security. Now, if a buyer needs vendor or seller's financing to buy a business, clearly the bank won't lend them the money. Now, if the bank won't lend them the money, that means they don't have the security. So you can't suddenly magic up security for the seller of the business. So that's a serious con. If something goes wrong, no security on the loan, the business tanks, the earnout doesn't happen. So what are the pros? Well, that's simple. From the seller's point of view, they're going to get full value for the business. The business is growing. They're going to get the full future value of the business. And that's a huge pro. From the buyer's point of view, they're getting to buy a business that they couldn't have bought otherwise. Now, if they could have bought the business outright, if they could have got bank loans, if they could have got the funding, they would have done so. They didn't need to do an earnout. But they did. So by going through the earnout process and maybe paying a little bit more going down the track, that's fine. They get to own a business they otherwise wouldn't have owned. And it's clearly a good business because it's growing. And it's growing based on that earnout calculation. Everybody believes it's going to grow, so they're getting a good business. They also get to employ the owner. Now, by employing the owner, they get to squeeze and extract the last bit of detailed information out of the owner into the business. Sure, the business is going to be systemized. Sure, it's going to have processes and good staff and good employees and all that sort of stuff. But getting that last bit of gold out of the owner to ensure your success, that's worth every cent of those extra payments on the earnouts. So if you want to know more about seller's finance, check out that video up there. I go through a case study of a buyer named Rowett. He wanted to buy a business using seller finance. He basically did everything wrong. So you can learn from Rowett and that video. Thanks for watching. I'll see you over there. See you next time.